Here in Working Phase Part 3, we're going to be talking about notes and high-risk clients. So how to document what has happened during a session and how to deal with high-risk clients. In Working Phase 1, we talked about treatment plans as far as the goals and objectives. In Working Phase 2, we talked about interventions. We're going to continue on with the notes. So there are 3 different types of notes that we're going to focus on for this class. And one of them, the SOAP note, is very common among many different disciplines, but we're going to focus on STIPS, SOAP, goal and action plan. These are 3 ways that we can document what has gone on during a session. What's important to note is that when you are working in the field, you will be asked to document your sessions differently than another place. So there's really no one standard way across the entire discipline. But knowing how to do these 3 notes will prepare you for any kind of documentation that you might have to do. So why do we have case notes in the first place? Well, the reality is that we need to be able to document what happened during a session, and our memory is just not good enough. It's difficult to remember what happened earlier in the day in your own life, let alone what happened during a session. So we have to document these things. One of the cognitive biases that human has is that we think that we remember more than we do. And what happens is that when we don't remember the details, we fill in the blanks, and that can create misinformation and false memories. So we need to use notes as a way to document what happened during session. Some people will get comfortable with not doing notes during the session, meaning that they will just listen to the other without taking any notes on paper or anything. But at first, it's going to be very reasonable for you to take notes, especially until you learn about the other person. If you see somebody for session after session, you begin to learn about them and to know about them, and you can remember their story, but you might have to jot down some details and things as they come up. So relying on memory is not good enough. We have to be able to document what happens. Another reason why we use case notes is because agencies, so whether that's private practice, community mental health, whatever it is, will require notes for the passing of information. We need to be able to pass information on to other people in case we don't see the individual who we're counseling for the entirety of their therapeutic episode. So we need to be able to pass information along. We also need to be able to pass information onto the court system if they require it or if it's mandated. Or if we need to report to a supervisor, or if we are being supervised as a limited licensed practitioner. We need to be able to pass information along as much as is reasonable in the given setting. Another reason why we have to have case notes is because we need to be able to bill for our services. Billing is a very important part of practice. We need to be able to document what we're doing and prove that we're working toward our treatment outcomes through our treatment goals and objectives and using the interventions that we said that we were going to. The goal and action plan format of doing case relies entirely on addressing goals through the treatment plan. So you can see that the billing process incorporates the information that we've taken from the intake assessment, and we have created the goals that we are going to address using the interventions that we are skilled in doing. So we need to be able to prove all of that, and doing case notes is one way that we prove that we're doing what we said that we're going to do. And also, notes are required as an ethical practice. We need to make sure that we are doing due diligence to provide the best care that we possibly can, and creating case notes based on the information that we are getting from our clients is one of the best ways to do that, so that we can stay informed about the individual and not rely on our memory, which we've already declared is not good enough. So what goes into a case note? Every case note has certain characteristics. It all has content, so what happened during the session, so documenting the story of the session. It all has some kind of action, so what we did or what we did for the client or with the client, or what we did to help the client to do something on their own. So we've talked about these factors that we have, the cognitive factors, affective experiencing, and the rehearsal factors that go toward our intervention. So what did we do to help them? And also, what did they do? What did they report? What did they say that was based on their ability to attain their objectives and then eventually their goals. And then the last part that's included in all case notes is what's the goal, or what's the, or not the goal, what's the plan or the implication of working toward the goal. So what does it mean that something happened and we did something in the session? So there are facts of the session, the content. There's the action, what one of you did, either you as the clinician or the other person as the interviewee or the client. What did they do? And then what are you going to do going forward as a result of those two items? Or what did the result of the, or excuse me, what was the implication or the result of the session? We want to make sure that we have a plan for moving forward based on the new information that we got from the session. Every session should be progressive. So let's jump into the first type of case note. The STIPS format is a combination of 5 aspects that you can reasonably discuss or experience during a session. So you have signs and symptoms. What are some of the things that you observe about the individual that are related to just regular functioning or related to their goals? So if it's a sign and symptom, it's something like if you had an individual who came in and is trying to work through anger issues, a sign and symptom might be, well, the person came in feeling very agitated, or they came in saying that they got into a fist fight in the Walmart parking lot, or whatever it is. What are the signs and symptoms related to the issue that brought them into therapy in the first place? The topic of discussion is quite literally what you talked about. Just the simple topic of discussion. We talked about the fight they had at Walmart. We talked about escalating emotionally to where they're not regulating their own emotions effectively. Whatever you talk about during that topic of discussion. The intervention is what you did. Maybe you talked about how to regulate emotion. Maybe you talked about intensity. Maybe you talked about faulty cognitions. Maybe you talked about an impaired worldview. Whatever it is, you can list that in your intervention, something that you did to help teach the person about some kind of thought process, help them work their emotions, or help them practice a new behavior. Whatever it is, it has to be something that you did. What did you do to help the individual? Maybe you brought awareness. Maybe you brought some insight. Whatever it is, you talk about what you did as the clinician. The P is for progress and plans. So what are you working toward? What are some of the plans that you have? What kind of progress was made? Maybe they did a good job of managing their anger throughout that week. Maybe they used a coping skill that they've not been able to implement because they've had problems with expressing themselves, whatever it is. And then the S stands for special issues. What are some of the things that came up that might need additional attention? So if the person did get into a fist fight and was arrested, maybe you need to talk about that process because apparently something escalated to a certain point that they had to have some kind of corrections involved. So whether it's criminal justice or whether it is through police interventions, that was a special issue for that individual. So anytime a special issue comes up that's kind of above and beyond the regular therapeutic experience, bring that up. And it could be something like disclosing of abuse or violence or self-harm or whatever. Whatever it is, if it catches your eye, if it's something that sticks out to you, include it in the special issues section. Here's an example of what a STIPS format note might look like. Again, it's broken up because it is a PowerPoint, but this is the content that you would include at each step. So for signs and symptoms, this is somebody who has depression, obviously. So the client presents with a depressed mood with visible signs of weeping and that speech is pressured. So that would be a very brief example of the signs and symptoms. That's what we observed in the individual. The topic could be something like, we spoke about the recent bouts of emotional abuse in the home and in the car ride to session. This has been occurring since my first session and the client has not improved. We explored aspects that lead to a safer interaction with people in the home. So the topic is just what you talked about, the ideas that came up that are related to the therapeutic relationship. If you engage in small talk to start out the session, which is completely fine, you don't need to include that there unless something was interesting or something was therapeutic. But generally, you just include what the topic was based on the reason why they came to therapy. Interventions, we looked at some cognitive distortions that are pervasive in the client's logic. The main distortion is personalization, where somebody might think that everything is their fault or believe that they have more of a role than they actually do. We explored the feelings that lead to internalizing that shame that is placed on the client by the people in the home. So you talk about what you did to bring awareness, to maybe address the cognitive distortions, whatever it was, you did it as the therapist with the individual. It's different than the topic because the topic is just describing what happened. The intervention is what you did as a result. The progress, so you can talk about the progress for this specific example. The progress has been slow but steady. The intensity of the issues and inability to escape will lead to a longer term therapy duration. So the progress can kind of bleed into some kind of a plan and talking about the duration of the therapeutic episode based on what you know. Sometimes we call that the prognosis. That's more in the medical setting, but it can be in the therapy setting as well. And then the special topics. At this time, there are no special issues. The client declines critical behaviors and signs of physical abuse are absent. So had the person come in with maybe a black eye or something like that, that might be a special topic because it is something that even though is part of some kind of domestic violence or domestic abuse, which is maybe why they're coming into therapy, having a black eye or bruising or whatever is certainly a special topic because it's disclosure of new abuse. So that's the STIPS format. Let's move on to the SOAP note format. The SOAP notes are widely used in medical settings. That's anything from general practitioners, physicians, obstetrics, gynecology, urology, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, psychiatric units, anything like that will use some version of a SOAP note. It may not be broken down into nice, neat SOAP, although many of them are, but the SOAP note is designed to have a subjective, objective, assessment, and plan sections. So the subjective section is the information from the client's point of view. Subjective in this case means what is the person experiencing? It doesn't matter if it's distorted, right, wrong, or whatever, it's what they are experiencing. You can also include information from people that are close to the client. So if somebody lacks insight, they aren't aware of a lot of the ways that their thinking or their behavior influences their mental health and vice versa, somebody near to them can help to explain that somebody was engaging in behavior that they need to be talking about but aren't. So when we include the subjective, it includes feelings and thoughts. That's from the client's perspective. Objective information is information that we make assessments about as skilled clinicians. It becomes objective because we are able to use our critical thinking in order to identify some trends or behaviors or cognitions or whatever. We're skilled, so we can use objective measures. So we can also use empirical means using scales. How are you doing today on a scale of 1 to 10? We could use any number of assessment strategies that we'll talk about in Unit 2 in order to gather information about the client's functioning. We can also use measurements from the goal-oriented behavior. So if somebody comes in talking about how they used one method of declining or of decreasing their cognitive distortions, then you can say that the person used one instance of reducing their cognitive distortions. That becomes an objective measure. We can also make assessments about their behavior. So if somebody comes in looking like a certain way, like if they look disheveled, then we can say that objectively they appeared disheveled, and upon further investigation, it's because they were rushed to get out the door because their alarm didn't go off or something like that. That's an objective measure. The assessment is kind of a combination of the subjective and the objective. So what we will do is we will say, okay, based on what I've observed, here's what I think is going on. When you talk about your impression of what's going on, that's an assessment. You are assessing, I don't care about you, email. You are assessing what's going on based on your clinical expertise. So if somebody reports that they came in disheveled, or that you notice that they came in disheveled, they report that their alarm went off, the assessment is it appears that they're having a hard time managing their regular routines, and that we need to talk a little bit more about setting alarms appropriately or setting reminders or whatever it is. The P stands for the plan. The plan is what you're going to do based on what you have experienced during the assessment. So if you create an assessment and you think that there needs to be something done, then you'll talk about it in the plan. If it's just to continue ongoing therapy, then you're fine. Generally, the plan will follow the same kind of plan that we talked about in the STIP. So the progress and plan is a lot of the same thing in the P for SOAP note. An example of a SOAP note, for the subjective, the client expresses issues with the family and the home. The client reports multiple instances of yelling and threatening. So if they report that, that's subjective. If you witness it, it can be objective, but generally if they come in talking about having fights in the home, it's subjective. The objective part of this might be something like the client was visibly upset and had a hard time maintaining a consistent affect, meaning that they couldn't remain emotionally in tune with how they were feeling. So they were expressing themselves differently than how they were feeling. Themes of sadness and futility were present during the course of the session. So we can say that objectively, these things that we talked about were sad and futile, where they felt like they couldn't get ahead or they couldn't make any progress. The assessment is that the client is enduring a chaotic home life. That statement is based on the subjective and objective, that what they were talking about is happening in the home and what we witnessed in the session. This does not seem to be easily alleviated, meaning that they can't overcome it easily. They need some help. Futility could lead to a more troublesome outlook for future progress. So we're making an assessment that based on the futility that they're expressing, that could create problems going forward. So as a result of the assessment, the plan going forward is continued discussion of the issues at home will be paramount to success, which is really just a statement of ongoing therapy. We're going to keep talking about this thing. Possible Child Protective Service intervention would be necessary if imminent threat is suspected. With the current atmosphere in the home, gains in therapy would be negated. So the plan going forward kind of also has its own little micro assessment. The plan going forward is to do these things, but without them, so if the current atmosphere remained, gains would be negated. There would be a problem making progress in the home. So that's the SOAP format. The goal and action plan format follows right along with the goals that you established in the treatment plan. This is pretty commonly integrated into the SOAP note itself, but we're going to treat them as separate for the sake of learning so that you can learn the distinction there. The goal and action plan format is based on the treatment plan, and you really rely on your ability to have created good goals, objectives, interventions. Action plans can also be considered interventions. So if you see action plan, you can think of interventions generally. We oftentimes see this in the juvenile justice system. The idea is that if you complete the interventions and the objectives, then the goals will take care of themselves. That is a general idea, but the juvenile justice system tends to oversimplify that. The court system really does like a goal and action plan format, case note and treatment plan that allows them to just kind of almost assign points to determine if they've completed some kind of outcome. So if they can achieve a certain level, or if a rating goes up based on what you've assigned, or based on what you've declared in the goal and action plan or through the treatment plan, then they will consider the person to be rehabilitated and they are set to go. We know in practice that doesn't work, but we do the best that we can with the parameters that we're given by the juvenile justice system especially, but in the court system in general. So the goal and action plan format. So the goals is what will be addressed today. So in the case note, you start with, we addressed goal number 1. The goal attainment is what did we do or what interventions did I use in order to help that person achieve that goal. And sometimes you can talk about the objectives too, but generally you're working more toward the goal. The intervention better be working toward the objective though. Clinical impressions are what you think is going on each session. So it's kind of a combination of a subjective and subjective and objective impression. So we're going to talk about what we think is going on based on what the client told us and based on our own observations. And then the action plan is what we're going to do for next step or for next session. As you can see, the goal and action plan format does overlap with the SOAP note. But the distinct difference is that in the SOAP note, you kind of might tie in a goal, you might not, you might just talk about the topic. But in the goal and action plan format, you are talking about the goal itself and how you're working to address the goal. So everything is based on the goal itself as opposed to just more of a conversation style of talking about whatever comes up. Generally, even having a conversation style will revolve around the goal, but in the goal and action plan format, you are required to address some kind of goal or some kind of basic outcome that you've established in the treatment plan. So an example of a goal and action plan format, the goal for the session might be the client will understand that issues in the home are not solely the client's fault. So this would probably obviously revolve around some kind of other goal that you've created in the treatment plan. It's kind of difficult to talk about an example of this without having a full treatment plan, but you can see how the goal for the session will hinge on the goal overall in treatment. The goal attainment, we identified the details about the issues in the home and disputed the beliefs about those details that lead to the client to take blame. This is kind of a rationally emotive behavior therapy where you're using some kind of method to dispute faulty cognitions. So if the goal is to understand the issues in the home are not solely the client's fault, you're going to look at all of those things that they think they're their fault and try to dispute them. The clinical impression is that the client agreed on more than one occasion with that the client unfairly assumes the role of the whipping boy, meaning that the client will usually take the role of the person who gets blamed for it to help other people not get blamed. We call that a whipping boy. Not a very nice thought, but there it is. The action plan is that we'll continue to discuss this next session as the progress made is worth building on without moving on to another goal. So if you want to keep working on that goal because it looks like there's some substantial progress, then you can put that in the action plan. But as you can see, everything's kind of self-contained and it revolves around the goals and it includes what you've done and will continue to do. Now, those are the 3 different types of of case notes. We'll do a case note activity in class that will watch a short YouTube clip and kind of work through each type. But for now, we're going to move on to high-risk clients. So when you are working with your clients, you have these high-risk clients that need special attention, especially with case notes and how you write about the high-risk clients. But the high-risk clients are people who maybe are high risk for self-harm, criminal behavior, people who are particularly vulnerable. Those people are high risk for some kind of behavior or thought process that can lead them to danger. So sometimes we need to report these individuals if they are an imminent threat to themselves or others. That's more of a conversation that we have in social work ethics, but it could also be something that is a mindset that the individual has expressed that can lead them to poor behavior. So if somebody says something like, I really don't have anything else to live for and I feel like all I want to do is drink away my problems, that can be a highly problematic behavior that would make them high risk, because if they begin to drink, then they could decompensate into a state where they're feeling more and more likely to harm themselves. So even if they didn't express harming themselves in that moment, it could lead them to harm themselves in the future. Again, it doesn't need to be physical harm. Criminal behavior is high risk, obviously. If somebody is going to engage in criminal behavior, that means that generally there is some kind of victim out there. And although we can't necessarily report just criminal behavior in general, we have to be careful about how we document our conversations with those individuals, especially with respect to how we document what we have done to intervene in that criminal behavior. It might sound weird, but if somebody declares that they're going to go and rob somebody, there's not a lot we can do to stop them or report them, because the limits of our confidentiality usually go to expressed or imminent threats to self-harm or harming others, not necessarily just stating that they are going to go rob somebody. A very slippery slope, but that's the nature of it. That's why it's important to be very familiar with your bounds of ethics. Sometimes when we have to contact somebody else, it can be an agency, a supervisor, authorities, or whatever. We can talk to supervisors about lots of issues without breaking confidentiality, but that's just so that we can get guidance on what to do about it. That doesn't guarantee that anything is going to get reported, but we can talk to supervisors or peers to get information about how to proceed. When we're documenting our work with high-risk clients, there's some very important aspects you have to keep in mind. The first is document exact phrases and quotations. If you are going to make a claim that somebody is suicidal and you want to report that to the authorities, they're going to ask you, what exactly did they say? Because they have a legal restriction on what they can act on. If you said that, well, they were just kind of generally talking about wanting to harm themselves, the police officer is going to say, well, that doesn't mean anything to us. We need to have specific words. That way, when we take custody of the individual, we can do it rightfully. But if you said something like, hey, they said, and I quote, "I'm going to kill myself as soon as I leave here," then they can act on that. Now, obviously, that's a very blatant way of saying that they're going to harm themselves, but it could be something like, well, the client said, "I don't have anything else to live for, and I'm not sure why I want to keep on going." And then you couple that with the idea that they have access to weapons and things like that, and that in the past they have harmed themselves, so there's a history. Coupling those together will lead to certainly some kind of action. So make sure that you use exact phrases and quotations to help build a case in case you have to report something. Also, because you never know when you're going to need to know the exact words that they used in order to look and see what kind of mindset they might be in. When you document high-risk clients, don't interpret anything. If somebody said something menacing and you want to interpret what that means, it better be in the context of a conversation with the individual, not just thinking back on it and thinking, oh, I wonder if they meant this. If it's a high-risk client, don't wonder what they meant. Give them a call and say, hey, you know what? I was thinking about this after we talked today. What did you mean when you said this? That way you can get an interpretation from them. You can get what they meant as opposed to you just kind of guessing at their meaning. We need to remember that we are not legal authorities and we don't have the right ourselves to take legal action against somebody. We may have to work with a lawyer. We may have to work with police officers. We may have to work with judges, whoever. We need to make sure that we're ready to work with these people when we want to act on something. And remember that as much as we want to help others and maintain a good therapeutic relationship with somebody, we need to remember to cover our butts. We cannot practice our craft if we are working under a suspended or revoked license. So we need to make sure that we are protecting our ability to work first, because if we do that, then everything else will fall into place. If I'm protecting my ability to work, then that means that I'm looking out for the best interest of the individual, because part of our ethical code is that we maintain privacy, confidentiality, and the safety of the people that we're working with, as well as working with authorities and officials to make sure that they are well taken care for. If we're acting in good faith and we have presented a good case, for example, for reporting somebody's intent to harm, we're going to be covered by our ethics. We're not going to have anything come back against us. Somebody might be mad at us for a really long time, but I'd rather have somebody be mad at me and alive than happy that I was their buddy but dead. Okay? So keep that in mind. It is important that you are developing a good relationship with them, but when it's time to make a really difficult call, you have to be ready to do it. So that's it for working phase part 3, where we covered notes and high risk clients. We will be talking about working phase 4, termination, how we end the therapeutic relationship next time, and that will wrap up unit 1.